There's been a lot of discussions recently about Broadway shows coming over to the UK. It makes a lot of sense why it's happening now because we've started to see more and more closure notices come out for certain shows that have been around for a while, like Tina or MJ, meaning that these theatres are opening up. And naturally, when people hear show closing, they start to think of what's going there next. It's the life cycle of theatre, where one show closes, just open up another one. Naturally, within this thought process, there's a lot of shows that are already well established, that look towards coming into the West End, and a great place to look for these is Broadway. Especially after the last Broadway season, that felt like it really hit its stride with great new musicals. It kind of reignited the conversation. A lot of people have been speaking about Death Becomes Her, maybe Happy Ending, even plays like John Proctor as the villain, Oh Mary, all of these shows from the current season that could very easily come over to the UK. But not every Broadway show makes it to the UK. Some Broadway shows have to wait decades upon decades to finally make it onto a London stage, or even a UK stage in general. So today we're going to speak about musicals, mainly from the past couple of years, that have still yet to come to the West End. We're going to speak a little bit about why they maybe haven't come over yet. We're going to speak about ones that are actually fairly likely to come over but are just waiting for the right theatre. We're going to speak about shows that may be better going to an off-West End house, and we're going to try and assign theatres to each of these Broadway shows. But if you haven't seen my face before, hi, I'm Ellie, I talk about theatre. I am the most chaotic theatre person on the internet. I do reviews, I do discussions, I do versus brackets, rankings, game shows, and so much more. And if any of that sounds interesting to you, please consider hitting like and subscribe. It really helps me, it helps out the channel. But let's dive in to Broadway shows that have yet to come to the UK. Now, before we discuss the shows that I have picked, a few ground rules. First of all, this is mainly a list of shows that have been around in the past decade or so. I need to at least know a little bit about them, and frankly, after a while, shows do eventually make their way over here, or fade into complete obscurity. There's going to be so many more shows not on this list that we could discuss and talk about, so much so we could do this again. We could do it in the future. So if there's any shows that you'd love to see come over to the UK that haven't yet, leave your suggestions in the comments. But my other rule, my other stipulation, is I'm not going to speak about any show that was in the last season on Broadway. Because the answer to the question, why have they not come over to the UK yet, is they literally have not had time. How do you expect them to have come over yet? I think it would be a miracle if they've managed to bring the show over by now. Things like Maybe Happy Ending, Death Becomes Her, they're most likely already looking at theatres over here. Honestly, it's even a push to speak about some of the shows from last season, but there are a handful of shows I do want to discuss from there. So my one rule is that I'm not going to speak about any shows from June 2024 to now. Let's start. And let's start with the musical I think is the most obvious to start with. Whenever any theatre opens up in London, even if it is literally the worst choice for this show, if a theatre somehow becomes free, there will be one person, at least one person online, asking for this show to go there, saying surely now is the time. Now is the time that Beetlejuice comes over to London. If you don't know, Beetlejuice is a musical that opened on Broadway at the Winter Garden Theatre a couple of years ago, based quite obviously on the film of the same name. This is a show with a phenomenally interesting production history, having initially struggled on Broadway but managing to build a name for itself through TikTok fame. It closed at the Winter Garden a little bit earlier than expected, and then eventually moved to the Marquee. And is actually returning to Broadway, now going to the Palace as part of its US tour. Doing something very similar to what Meir is doing with its US tour, going to the Winter Garden. Beetlejuice is a very popular show. Beetlejuice is one that people have been clamouring for. And I think there is just one reason. There is one very simple reason that Beetlejuice has not made it over to the UK yet. And that is the theatre. If you look at the set for Beetlejuice, it is massive. It's big. It is bulky and massive, and it kind of needs to be. There's a lot of tricks that come with that show, and with that main set, the house. And the key difference between Broadway theatres and London theatres is that we have a lot of playhouses, and a lot of theatres that were originally built for plays to be performed in. So whereas Broadway theatres have fairly large stages, have stages that are bigger in width than height, we tend to be a little bit more squashed in. So while there have been theatres that have opened up for Beetlejuice, there's a lot of theatres where it just wouldn't actually work on those stages. Theatres like the Trafalgar, which has opened up quite a few times, is simply too small. Even a stage like the Savoy feels too small. So Beetlejuice is kind of left with very few options when it comes to the right theatre. But while there is a lot of people clamouring for Beetlejuice to come to the West End, and I will be the first person to put my hand up and say, please give it to us, we have been waiting for so long, it also can't go into a theatre that's too big. Because while Beetlejuice, yes, has managed to find an audience for itself, it's never really been a massive smash hit on Broadway. Obviously, it was performing well towards the end of the run at the Winter Garden, and we didn't really get to see how it would have lasted through those few final months that were cut off short by COVID. But during its marquee run, it only lasted a couple of months on Broadway post-pandemic. It's going to be very interesting to see how the run fares at the Palace. But we don't want Beetlejuice to come in for a short run. We want Beetlejuice to have a theatre that it can sit down in. So it's the case of balancing the size of the stage and the size of the audience, because a lot of the stages that feel like they are wide enough in width to suit Beetlejuice feel like they have too big of an audience. A lot of people have pointed to a theatre like Dominion, which, yes, staging wise and like the size of the actual performance space itself feels completely correct. But that is a 2,000 seat theatre, which many shows very much struggle to sell. A theatre like the Dominion has opted in the past couple of years to not have massive long runner shows. Instead, opting for shorter runs, like that entire season where we were having like Grease and Dirty Dancing and Sister Act coming in for short little runs. These tours and these productions that were built to tour going into there for a little bit. Because it's very hard to maintain a run at a theatre at that size. It's not to say shows can't be successful there. Obviously, a show like Real Rock You played there for 12 years, and Devil Wears Prada, while some of those numbers have started to dwindle a little bit, did have a very successful start to its West End run. And I think there's a handful of theatres like this for Beetlejuice. The Prince Edward is one that a lot of people have been floating around recently, which I do think would be a good choice for that show. It would need to be shrunk down a little bit, I feel, but it's not too far away from the right size. But it's a question of how long can Beetlejuice maintain an audience that is a little bit bigger. So there's a lot of theatres that I feel like we could point to that could house Beetlejuice, but it's just going to be a case of how much do they want to balance the size of the audience and the size of the set. We've seen them adapt the size of the set for things like Tour, but they're going to want to have the big flashy spectacle that they had on Broadway in the West End. I think the Adelphi would probably be a theatre that would suit Beetlejuice fairly well, even if the set would definitely need to shrink a little bit. I think if they wanted to have a shorter run or test out doing a 12-week run and extend if it does well, maybe it could go somewhere like Dominion, or even somewhere like the Gillian Lynn. But I do think that Beetlejuice is going to come very soon. We are hearing whispers that it may be going to the Prince Edwards, and I would be surprised if we don't see that come to fruition. Out of every show I'm going to speak about today, this is the one that I can hold my hand up and say I don't think we're going to need to wait longer than a year to see this show in the West End. We've already waited long enough, and they want it, we want it, we're going to get it. Going from that to a show that I actually think would really struggle to come over to the UK. Not even because of the quality of the show, but more from a case of how it would have to market itself. And that is the stunningly gorgeous musical Suffs. If you don't know the musical Suffs, this was a musical written by MichellinaaB, which performed last year at the Music Box Theatre on Broadway. This musical surrounds the suffragette movement in America, surrounding Alice Paul and a bunch of different people from that movement. It was performed with an all-female cast. It sadly didn't manage to run on Broadway as long as it wanted to. I think some of the politics and some of the results of last year's American election definitely weren't perfect for a show like Suffs, but the quality of the musical speaks for itself. But I don't even think it's the show itself that makes it hard to bring over to the UK. The problem with bringing Suffs to the UK is the fact that we have our own suffrage movement. And when you hear the word Suffs or the word suffrage in the UK, you don't think of the Americans. You think of Emmeline Pankhurst. You think of that suffragette movement. You think of it specifically being within the UK. So the question becomes, how do you market a show about the other suffragette movement? The suffragette movement that is very similar to the UK one, but is not surrounding any of the people that UK audiences know. The other problem for Suffs is that we already have a musical that has been slowly developing itself and has developed a cast album that is yet to release, that if Suffs ever tried to come to the UK, we know that that musical would suddenly pop back up again, and that is Sylvia. Sylvia is a musical that actually surrounds the UK suffragette movement, taking a lot of influence from musicals like Hamilton. This surrounds both Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughter Sylvia. So Suffs is in a very difficult position when it comes to trying to come to the UK. Just from the nature that to a UK audience, it's a hard sell, and you've got a lot of hoops to jump through from a marketing perspective to actually get people to know what they're going in for. So sadly, I do think that Suffs is unlikely to come to the UK. If it ever comes over, I could see it being one that a lot of like universities could do. We see a lot of musicals that are done by the colleges. Musicals like Bonnie and Clyde and Catch Me If You Can, which keep that name in your mind, we'll come back to it. These musicals were first done in the UK by university groups and by colleges like Bird and Arts Ed. I could see a show like Suffs being a top choice for those colleges to do. But when it comes to a full professional production, I think Suffs is unlikely to come, and if it does come, I think it's a long way away. If it did, however, I would love to see Suffs at a theatre like the Noel Coward, or it could possibly work somewhere like the Garrick. From what I've seen of Suffs, it doesn't seem like Suffs had loads and loads of sets or massive demands that means that they couldn't shrink it down onto a stage like the Noel Coward or the Garrick. But obviously that's me saying that from an outside perspective, and there may be a scene from the show that I don't know that means that they could never go into a theatre smaller than the Theatre Royal Drury Lane. Next, let's talk about a Best Musical winner that has actually discussed previously a potential London life, and that is Kimberly Akimbo. Kimberly Akimbo won the 2022 Best Musical Award and surrounds a young girl called Kimberly, a teenager with a syndrome that forces her to age rapidly. And I don't feel like I need to speak for ages about this show, because we already have some discussions about where it could potentially go if it was ever to come to London. These came directly from the writer, Janine Tesori, who mentioned in an interview a while back that if they were going to bring Kimberly Akimbo to the UK, it would more likely be to an off-West End place. She mentioned two theatres specifically, the Young Vic and the Hampstead, these both being theatres where two of her musicals previously went. The Young Vic saw the UK premiere of Fun Home, and a revival of Caroline or Change went to the Hampstead. Now, the Broadway version of the show, how it was done there, would probably more likely suit a theatre like the Young Vic. But it is also important to note that since Fun Home came to the UK, the artistic director of the Young Vic has changed. but these do seem like the best choices for if Kimberly Akimbo was going to come to the UK. I don't think it would be a show that would hop straight into the West End, because even with the best musical label attached to it, it isn't the clearest and the biggest commercial sell. So I wouldn't be surprised if Kimberly Akimbo did actually take the off-West End route. Another musical that I feel like might take a similar route is The Prom. I love The Prom so much. It's a musical that didn't really do massively well on Broadway, which is likely another reason that we haven't seen it over here yet. But it's this really sweet story, especially more relevant now with how politics is going, especially in America, about a girl who is banned from her high school prom because of her sexuality. And a group of Broadway actors hear about this and decide to head to the town to help in whatever way they can. It's so fun. It's got some great representation in there. It's a lovely, sweet musical that could be really good to shrink down a little bit. The Prom isn't a show that needs a massive set, and I do feel like if The Prom does come to the UK now, it will be in an original production, a non-replica production. So I don't think we're just limited to how the Broadway production laid things out. I think if The Prom is going to come over here, it's going to go smaller. I think the perfect theatre for it would be somewhere like The Other Palace. The Other Palace has taken a lot of shows from America that have had a very similar teenage audience. Heathers, Be More Chill, most recently with something like The Lightning Thief. And now that we've seen shows with kind of similar concepts eventually close and leave the West End, because when The Prom did open on Broadway, we still had everybody's talking about Jamie in the West End. Both shows surrounding queer people and their struggles going to prom. They had very similar concepts, which meant that if The Prom was going to come over at that point, they would be in direct contrast and conflict with each other. Now that the dust has kind of settled on that and Jamie has finished up its UK tour, now is probably the best time to bring The Prom over to the UK. I wouldn't be surprised if we see it come over at some point, but I would be surprised if it was a show that went straight to the West End. I feel like it's much more likely that we're going to see it in a smaller house or even see it regionally first. Do you remember the musical I told you to put a pin into? We're coming back to it. Let's talk about one of the older musicals on this list, Catch Me If You Can. Catch Me If You Can is based on Frank Abagnale Jr.'s life, which was then adapted into the film starring Tom Hanks and Leo DiCaprio, and found itself becoming a musical back in 2009, with it eventually making it to Broadway in 2011. Now, I love a jazzy musical, and we don't have enough jazz musicals, and Catch Me If You Can has a gorgeous score, which I feel like a lot of people know songs from, but don't massively know the show. Like, you've definitely heard some musical theatre tenor sing Goodbye. You've definitely heard Fly, Fly Away. Like, these are songs that have cemented themselves, and become very popular, especially in auditions. It has some great material, but it didn't massively do amazingly well on Broadway. It was a bit of a harder sell, and most people don't really know the film amazingly well, so it kind of makes sense that it's never really made it over here. But while we haven't seen a full-scale production of Catch Me If You Can, they actually have workshopped it over here. I think it was last year we saw discussions of a new version of Catch Me If You Can being adapted and workshopped over here in London, with a bunch of different West End stars taking up the roles. This was done behind closed doors, and we don't know how much that new version is progressing, so it's actually not impossible that Catch Me If You Can could come over here. I do think if it does, it may be somewhere smaller as well. I think this may be a sort of playhouse. I think it may even be one that tries itself regionally. But it's not like there's no movement on Catch Me If You Can. I think it's going to be a very different version, both in staging direction and also within the book, than the Broadway version. Especially if they're going back into workshops and trying new things with it. But now that we've seen shows like Newsies and Next to Normal come over to the UK, this has kind of become like my longest and furthest white whale. The show that feels perfect to eventually make it over here, even if it's not like a huge production, but just hasn't. Let's keep on the theme of jazz musicals, actually, because the next musical I want to talk about is Bandstand. Bandstand premiered in a very, very busy season. And I think similar to something like Dead Outlaw this year, just kind of struggled in such a heavy hitter season. It was up against like Come From Away, Dear Evan Hansen, Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet of 1812, Groundhog Day. That is one of the most difficult Broadway seasons in recent memory. I don't think it's any surprise that Bandstand just kind of naturally struggled amongst those titans. But if you actually look at Bandstand and look at the material, even what's the pro shot that they've made that I think is on Broadway HD, it was on there. I don't know if it's still on there. But it's a really lovely and beautiful show. Set in the years following World War II, it centres around these veterans. These musicians who went off to fight in the army and then came back and found themselves struggling to get work. So, one man decides to build up this band, formed entirely of people who served in the military during the war. The show did win a Tony Award for its choreography, and was nominated as well for orchestrations, but beyond that, it hasn't really massively cemented itself into the music for the sphere. It's not like a show like The Prom, or even something like Catch Me If You Can, where people know some of the material. Or shows like Beetlejuice, where people are just clamoring for it. So I think it is one that is very unlikely to come over soon. If Bandstand is going to come over to UK, I think it's more likely we'll see it in a very small scale production. And I do have a potential theatre I would like to say. Because if Bandstand comes over to London, there is a theatre that put on their first musical in like 6 years. And that worked so well that I feel like there is a possibility that they could do something like Bandstand there. And that is the Arcola. I would love a really scaled down, like a really intimate version of Bandstand at that theatre. And I think especially with some of the discussions that Bandstand has, and the real emotional heart to it, I think having it in a much more intimate space could really, really work. I just think it's a show that is quite a hard commercial sell, and obviously didn't really massively pick up traction in the States. So coming over, it kind of has to market itself as something new. But please, I would love to see this musical on stage. It's so beautiful. And honestly, if we never get to see it, at least we do have that pro shot. Let's move on to another Best Musical winner that I'm almost shocked has never come over here, and that is A Gentleman's Guide to Love and Murder. Now, it is actually the case that most Best Musical winners have made the transfer to the UK. Diving back through like the 70-year history of the Tony Awards, it is hard to find Best Musical winners that haven't made the transfer to London yet. Forgetting ones that have won in recent years, so just haven't really had the time to come over yet, most of them have. So it feels even weirder that the one that is set in England hasn't come over. A Gentleman's Guide to Love and Murder is a black comedy about this man who realizes he is a member of this very rich and powerful family. But soon he realizes he's quite far behind in the ranks of the Dice Swifts. And so he starts to one by one take them out, to rise through the ranks, with all of the family members being played by the same one actor. It's campy, it's silly, it's very wink wink nudge nudge. Like, I'm really surprised it hasn't come over, because it feels like one that could actually click very well with British audiences. It has a lot of that sense of humour that feels very much in line with an Operation Mincemeat. Or like those British farces. Like, it feels like a very natural idea and something that could very easily come over. I'm honestly quite shocked it hasn't. I do think it would need a slightly smaller theatre. I think that is more obvious, but I don't think we need to go as small as something like the Trafalgar. I think if we did get this musical over here, it's probably more likely to go regional now. Like, surely at some point we will get a UK premiere of this musical, but I'm still kind of baffled it hasn't happened yet, because this seems like a show that could very easily market itself over here. It's got very easy comparisons to other comedies that have clicked very well with UK audiences, as well as having the Tony wins behind it to call it the award-winning Best Musical. But if you were going to take it to a West End theatre, a theatre the size of somewhere like the Apollo or the Garrick could likely house this musical. It doesn't have a massive cast. I mean, most of the characters are played by one actor, so... And even though it would likely be a new production, the Broadway version didn't have a massive set. It played at the same theatre that Hadestown is in, and that's managed to downscale itself onto the stage like the Lyric. I would be surprised if we never see this musical in the UK, but it's just been a very long time, and I'm like, how is it not yet? How has no one brought it over yet? I'm still confused. I'm very confused. Let's speak about a musical that has actually already mentioned the potential of coming to London, but has kind of gone quiet, and that is How to Dance in Ohio. This musical platformed a lot of neurodiverse voices, and while it was a great show for authentic representation, didn't massively click with Broadway audiences, and had a few things that it could tweak and tighten up. So taking some time off to rework some of that material and bringing it over to London makes a lot of sense for this musical. We've seen other shows do similar things. A musical like Amelie went to Broadway with a production that wasn't really well favoured, and then eventually came over here in a completely new production that basically reverted a lot of it to the pre-Broadway version, and managed to give that show a clearer sense of identity. So it's not unheard of a show kind of struggling to find its audience and then finding it somewhere else. But I do feel like a pathway that's probably better for How to Dance in Ohio would be an off-West End approach. It's definitely got a lot of potential, and there's so few musicals around that really platform autistic characters and autistic voices as well. It feels like a musical that is very important right now. I think a lot of audiences are really craving that authenticity and that representation. That I do hope this musical does find a pathway soon, and that those previously mentioned plans do come to life. If they could take up a small West End theatre like the Ambassadors or the Trafalgar, I feel like they could manage to find an audience. Before I speak about the final musical I'm going to discuss today, let's throw out some quick honourable mentions. Jagged Little Pill is a musical that previously mentioned it was going to come to the UK, like officially announced it, and then quietly cancelled those plans. It's a musical that found itself in a lot of controversy with how it handled its non-binary character, rightfully so. That was a mess, to a point where I see it as unlikely that it will come over in that specific production. Some Like It Hot is another musical that's mentioned about potential London life. It might not be a musical that would go straight to the West End, especially because so much time has passed now that I'm not sure if people would massively know it from there. But it's a show that I could possibly see coming to the UK at some point, just maybe not massively soon. Tuck Everlasting is such a hard sell to UK audiences because we just don't know the book. We don't know the story. And when you tell people the plot of the story, they go, oh. It's a lovely little charming-ish musical, but didn't really make a massive splash in Broadway, so it makes sense it's never really come to the UK, and I'd be surprised if we saw a massive run for it. And finally, a musical that has technically come to the UK, but only for one performance, and that is If Then, which tried itself earlier this year in a concert production. It's a really lovely show, actually, and I really enjoyed that concert version. From that concert, it did seem like they were pushing for a West End run, but I would like to see the show get a full run at some point, maybe somewhere like the Other Palace. And the final show that I'm going to discuss today is The Notebook, because this is a show that didn't really do massively well on Broadway, but I think could do a lot better here. We love a film adaptation in London's West End. We do. And I think there is definitely a large majority of people who would definitely go and see a Notebook musical over here. Maybe even more so than there was an appetite for it on Broadway. I do think the Broadway run not being a massive success may be the only hindrance in this one coming over, but I think it makes a lot of sense for this show to come over at some point. I think when we're speaking about likelihood, I would put this one like under Beetlejuice in will come over at some point, and I think this is one that could go straight to the West End. Whether they want to tweak any of that material or fix things that didn't massively work on Broadway, that's up to them, and I feel like that would be the one thing that would cause a longer delay. But I could very easily see this musical going somewhere like the Shaftesbury Theatre. That feels like the right sized house for that musical. And there you go. That is a bunch of Broadway musicals that have yet to come over to the UK in full professional productions. Which of the shows that I mentioned are you most wanting to see over here in the UK? What are some shows that I didn't mention that you'd like to see come to the West End? Let me know all your thoughts in the comments down below. If you did enjoy this video, please consider hitting like and subscribe. It really helps me, it helps out the channel. Here's some links to some other videos on screen right now, and a link to my Instagram if you'd like to join me to follow over there. And a huge thank you to our channel members for supporting all the silly things that I do here. But that's it for me today, and I'll hopefully see you next time. Bye.